Savannah, Georgia, August 12, 1924. A construction crew widening Habersham Street breaks through an old brick wall and finds a room sealed since the Civil War. Inside, 12 crates, each marked with the initials TWW, each filled, not with relics, but with salted human remains. For nearly 70 years, the city denied that man ever existed. Thaddeus Wren, Undertaker, philanthropist, and rumored benefactor of Savannah's elite. His ledgers vanished, his house burned, his name erased. But beneath the courthouse foundations, they found a phrase carved into the brick: "The feast continues." This is the story Savannah tried to bury, a story of power, hunger, and the terrible price of forgetting. From the sealed archives of 1855, this is the Undertaker's feast, how the rich of Savannah ate their dead. Before we uncover the buried truth of Thaddeus Wren and the horrific enterprise that made him beloved among Savannah's wealthy, make sure you're subscribed and have the bell on. Comment below where you're listening from. Now let us return to the year 1850, when the city still glittered with promise. Savannah in the 1850s was a city balanced on the edge of prosperity and rot. Its avenues, lined with oak and dripping Spanish moss, gave the illusion of gentility. Beneath that green canopy, however, the air was sweet with decay, the mingling of salt marsh, river mud, and the lingering scent of sickness that summer never quite dispelled. The cotton economy had built palaces along Bull and Gaston streets. The city's elite, bankers, rice factors, and planters, competed to outshine one another with imported marble, Venetian mirrors, and grand dining tables meant to display their refinement. Yet their fortunes rested on the backs of thousands enslaved in the lowlands beyond, whose names never graced any record except for ledgers of purchase and death. Among this genteel society, Thaddeus Jonathan Wren stood apart. Wren was not a planter nor a merchant, but an undertaker, a profession that, in antebellum Savannah, hovered between necessity and taboo. Born in 1812 in Virginia's Tidewater region, Wren apprenticed under a cabinet maker who built both sideboards and coffins. When the yellow fever epidemic of 1839 swept through Richmond, the young craftsman found a grim opportunity: the manufacture of funeral boxes for the afflicted. By the time Wren arrived in Savannah in 1845, he carried with him a reputation for discretion and innovation. He opened Wren Company, Funerary and Sanitary Services, on Congress Street, advertising scientific preservation of the dead, imported embalming fluids, and hygienic interment according to modern European methods. His language, borrowed from medical journals, appealed to the city's professional class, eager to distance themselves from the crude burials of the poor. Wren was tall, soft-spoken, and impeccably dressed. His grey hair, even in youth, gave him an air of moral authority. He attended services at Christ Church, contributed generously to the Ladies' Orphan Relief Fund, and was known to visit the sick rooms of clients' families. His manner was always gentle, consoling, and correct. Yet those who worked closest to him, his apprentices, porters, and carriage boys, spoke of habits that unsettled them. He never allowed the living to enter his workroom after dusk. He dismissed servants before the preparation of a body and forbade anyone from touching the glass jars he kept labeled with initials and dates. He burned scraps of stained linen at midnight, even in the heat of summer. The building itself was curious: 3 stories of brick with a narrow courtyard leading to an underground workspace, cooled by the river's damp breath. Neighbors often remarked on the faint aroma of roasting meat that drifted from Wren's chimney on Sundays. Odd, considering that the man was said to dine at the club most evenings. Savannah's genteel classes, ever cautious of scandal, chose not to notice. In 1850, death was a familiar presence. Cholera and fever claimed dozens each season, and burial grounds filled faster than the city could consecrate new ones. Wren's services, efficient, sanitized, and solemn, brought comfort. He introduced imported zinc-lined coffins and hermetic preservation, claiming his methods prevented the spread of contagion. Behind the facade of science, Wren pursued a darker inquiry. Among his personal papers, later partially recovered from the Courthouse vault, were references to the extraction of the vital essence and the rendering of nutritive spirits from the deceased. His notes borrowed language from both anatomy and alchemy, disciplines he seemed to blur without distinction. A letter dated April 1851, addressed to a physician in Charleston, reads in part, "The tissues of the recently expired, when subjected to a gentle heat, yield an oil of extraordinary purity, equal to the finest animal fire, but free from putrefactive taint. I believe this substance, properly refined, may possess alimentary value for those of delicate constitution." The physician's reply, if one existed, was never found. By 1853, Wren's clientele included nearly every notable household in Savannah. He conducted funerals for the Habershams, the Mercers, and the Bullocks. His hearse, painted black with silver trim, became a familiar sight on Oglethorpe Avenue. But the prosperity of his firm was not solely due to funerals. Quietly, he had expanded his business into what he termed private catering for bereaved families. It was a discreet service, meals provided for guests following memorials, prepared in his own kitchens and served by his trusted staff. The city's upper class, enamored of European customs, found comfort in these somber feasts. Few asked what manner of meat graced the table, venison, mutton, or imported ham as they were told. Wren's staff knew differently. A surviving affidavit from a former servant, Elias Broom, recorded in 1868 and discovered in a private collection, states, "Mr. Wren kept a separate larder below, which none might enter. When the bodies came in from the hospital or the almshouse, he would choose one and dismiss us. By morning the meat room held new cuts wrapped in cloth, and the body was gone. He said they were taken to the pauper's pit, but I never saw them carried out." For years, such whispers circulated only among the enslaved and the poor, those whose words carried no weight in the courts of white Savannah. The city's elite considered Wren indispensable, a man who spared them from the indignities of decay. To understand the roots of his enterprise, one must understand the fear that haunted the antebellum South, the fear of contagion and pollution. Disease was believed to emanate from corruption, miasmas arising from decaying flesh. Wren, ever the opportunist, exploited that terror by promising purification. He spoke of rendering impurities harmless, a phrase that soothed his patron's way, concealing its dreadful double meaning. By 1854, records show his profits had tripled. He purchased an estate north of the city, Wren Hall, a neoclassical mansion overlooking the marshes near Bonaventure. There he built extensive cellars, supposedly for wine storage. The property included outbuildings for servants and a small chapel of his own design, windowless, whitewashed and locked. Visitors described the estate as immaculate, though strangely devoid of warmth. Wren lived alone save for a household staff of 5, a cook, 2 stable hands and a young housemaid named Caroline. All were enslaved, and none were permitted beyond the service quarters. In the summers, Wren hosted evening gatherings for select gentlemen, bankers, lawyers, and city officials. Servants carried trays of brandy and roast beef, and the guests spoke in hushed admiration of their host's refinement. No woman was ever invited. Letters preserved in the archives of the Savannah Republican reveal the esteem in which he was held. Mr. Wren's hospitality is of the most sober and edifying character. He speaks of mortality with a Christian's calmness and a scholar's understanding. But beneath the civility lay something colder. Wren had begun experimenting with methods of preserving not only flesh but spirit. His journals, fragmentary yet chilling, refer to the transference of essence through consumption. He appeared to believe that by ingesting the properly treated remains of the dead, one could absorb their vigor, their intellect, their refinement. This philosophy, a grotesque echo of classical medical theories, became the foundation of what he later called the Feast of Renewal. The first confirmed victim was Samuel Carter, a free black carpenter employed occasionally at the Wren estate. Carter disappeared in August 1854. His wife, Hannah, reported his absence to the City Watch, claiming he had gone to deliver timber for the Undertaker and never returned. Wren testified that Carter had been paid and dismissed, perhaps gone north seeking work. 3 weeks later, the Sunday roast served at Wren Hall bore a taste that guests described as peculiar, sweet, almost perfumed. No inquiry followed. Savannah's social code did not permit suspicion of a gentleman. By the dawn of 1855, Wren had perfected his system. He maintained contracts with both the city infirmary and the almshouse, securing rights to the unclaimed dead. The official purpose was burial and disinfection. In truth, the bodies passed first through his cellar, where the flesh was rendered, catalogued, and distributed among his circle under false labels. Each jar of tallow bore only initials, those of paupers, servants, or prisoners who would not be missed. And thus, beneath the magnolias and the marble facades, Savannah's finest dined on the very people their society had condemned to invisibility. By the spring of 1855, Thaddeus Wren's business stood at the peak of prosperity. The yellow fever that year struck Savannah with sudden cruelty. Nearly 500 souls perished between June and September. Every funeral carriage, every coffin, every wreath passed through his hands. The calamity made him indispensable. In city minutes from July 1855, his name appears under a hastily drafted ordinance. Authorization to manage sanitary disposal of epidemic victims. For this duty he was paid handsomely, $4 for each body removed from the infected districts. It was during this fever season that Nathaniel Harrow, a 19-year-old apprentice clerk, entered the Undertaker's employ. Nathaniel was the son of Jonathan Harrow, a tailor of Broughton Street, an honest tradesman fallen on hard times after his wife's death. The boy had received some schooling and wrote a fine hand, which commended him to Wren as a copyist and ledger-keeper. His wages were meagre, but he was proud to work in so reputable an establishment. In later depositions, Nathaniel's surviving letters provide the first clear window into what truly transpired within Wren's brick house. A letter dated August 2nd, 1855 to his father reads, "Mr. Wren is a peculiar but learned man. He speaks often of the sanctity of death and the duty of the living to make use of what is left behind. He says that waste is the enemy of providence. I copy his notes into the company record, though many of his phrases trouble me. He writes of essence drawn from corruption and bids me not ask questions." For several weeks, Nathaniel performed ordinary duties, recording invoices, maintaining accounts, and assisting with correspondence to the infirmary. But as the epidemic worsened, he began to notice anomalies. Receipts listed the collection of bodies that were never entered into burial records. Wagons left the courtyard by night, their loads covered with tarpaulins. The following mornings, the workrooms smelled faintly of smoke and something far sweeter. On August the 12th, Wren instructed Nathaniel to copy a series of notes titled Extracts of Value. These were inventories of glass jars, each assigned a letter and weight in ounces. Marginalia beside them bore familiar names: Carter, S. Abel, E. Mary, colored female, aged 9. That evening, the boy confided to a fellow apprentice, Henry Coe, that the names matched those listed among the pauper burials. Coe urged silence. "The master knows what he does. Do not bring trouble upon us." But Nathaniel's curiosity was not easily quieted. Late in August, he remained in the office after hours under pretense of balancing accounts. When the household retired, he crept into Wren's private workroom below the main floor, a space forbidden to all servants. The chamber was lined with slate shelves. Upon them rested dozens of sealed jars, each labeled with initials and dates, precisely as in the inventory. In the center stood a brass cauldron set over an iron grate. The faint residue of congealed fat clung to its sides. Nearby, a long table bore instruments of both mortuary and culinary kind: bone saws beside butcher's cleavers, spirit lamps beside pewter molds. Among the papers scattered there lay an open notebook, the edges darkened by heat. The writing within, elegant, deliberate, detailed trials in preservation and improved renderings. One passage, partly burned, read, "The material once purified may be introduced into ordinary dishes without offense to the palate. Thus the virtues of the deceased are not lost, but perpetuated. Consumption becomes consecration. Horrified, Nathaniel replaced the papers and fled. The following morning Wren regarded him with his usual calm, yet the boy felt the weight of those grey eyes upon him through the dirt. That night he returned home, pale and trembling, and told his father all. Jonathan Harrow, though appalled, urged caution. "You must not speak such things, Nat," he said. "The man is powerful. Let us pray on it." Still, Nathaniel could not let it rest. He approached Dr. Josiah Pemble, a young physician attached to the city infirmary, showing him a copy of one page he had secretly transcribed. Pemble, though intrigued, dismissed the boy's fears. "Alchemy and nonsense," he said. "Wren writes in metaphors. Undertakers fancy themselves philosophers." But the physician's tone betrayed unease, and within a week word of Nathaniel's inquiries reached Wren himself. On September the 5th, Wren summoned the apprentice to his study. The master's voice was kind, almost paternal. "You have been diligent, Nathaniel, yet diligence can become disobedience. Curiosity is not always a virtue. There are truths that unsettle weak minds." The boy stammered denials, but Wren merely smiled and offered him a glass of wine to steady the nerves. Nathaniel drank out of fear and courtesy. Within hours he was seized by violent cramps. His tongue swelled, his vision blurred, and a burning dryness gripped his throat. The attending physician, summoned by Wren himself, pronounced it a bilious fever, doubtless caught from the infected quarter. Over the next 3 days, Nathaniel's symptoms worsened. His father described them in a statement recorded years later. He lay stiff as a board, able to hear but unable to move. He could not cry out, though his eyes were wild. When at last he whispered, he said only, "Tell them, the jars beneath the floor." Then he fell into silence. He died on September the 9th, 1855, aged 19. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Josiah Pemble, reads simply, "Fever with paralysis, duration 4 days." The funeral was arranged, appropriately, by Wren Payne. Witnesses reported that the Undertaker himself attended, standing grave and motionless by the coffin, a gloved hand resting upon its lid. He offered condolences to the bereaved father and paid all expenses, insisting it was his Christian duty. That night, Elias Broom, the servant whose testimony would later surface, claimed to have heard faint knocking from the coffin stored in the cellar awaiting burial. He dared not open it. At dawn, the box was sealed and carted away to Laurel Grove Cemetery. No record of the plot exists today. Years later, fragments of Wren's private journal would shed further light on Nathaniel's final days. An entry dated September the 10th, the day after the boy's death, reads, "The young clerk proved most instructive. The tincture induces total muscular stillness while preserving full awareness. Duration, 4 hours. Thereafter coma and expiration. Subject observed by candlelight, respiration shallow but visible, not to be repeated unless in darkness." To the historian reading those words today, the horror lies not in passion or frenzy, but in method. Wren was a man of process. Every act, even murder, was recorded as a refinement of technique. For months thereafter, whispers of the boy's strange death circulated among servants and apprentices. Some spoke of ghostly tapping in the Undertaker's cellar, others claimed to see a pale figure at the windows after midnight. But Savannah's elite dismissed such tales as superstition. The epidemic had taken hundreds. What was one more? Still, small signs of unease crept into the city's polite society. Families who dined at Wren's post-funeral feasts began to complain of lingering sickness, faintness, nausea, dreams of choking. One matron, Mrs. Louisa Habersham, wrote in a private diary, later donated to the Georgia Historical Society, "The dishes were excellent, yet left a queer heaviness upon the stomach. I dreamt that night of our late cousin, standing by the table and weeping. I have since resolved to take only bread and tea at such gatherings. It was the first faint crack in Wren's carefully maintained facade. By the end of that autumn, the fever subsided and life in Savannah resumed its semblance of order. Yet the death of Nathaniel Harrow left a residue of rumor. Jonathan Harrow, consumed by grief, left the city and vanished from record. Some said he went west, others that he drowned himself in the river. Wren continued his trade unimpeded. His advertisements appeared weekly in the Republican, Wren coat embalmers and sanitary officers for the comfort of the bereaved and the preservation of public health. Behind those polished words, his secret work advanced. He had learned through Nathaniel's death the exact proportion of his paralyzing tincture. His notes refer to it as solution number 4, composed of antimony, laudanum, and a distillate derived from the rendered fat of the deceased. He believed this mixture capable of suspending the boundary between life and death, allowing the subject to approach the threshold without decay. Thus, Nathaniel's passing marked not the end but the perfection of Wren's science. When we read the surviving records today, the fragments, the contradictory testimonies, it is difficult to separate rumor from fact. Yet too many independent sources converge: the ledger, the jars, the missing burials, and the young clerk's notes hidden beneath his floorboards, found decades later during renovations. Together they form a pattern that cannot be dismissed as folklore. Narrator's closing tone deepens, drawing the listener toward Act 3. The tragedy of Nathaniel Harrow did not end his master's work. Rather, it sealed it in silence. The city, exhausted by plague and bound by propriety, preferred not to see. But in the years that followed, more names would vanish from the Undertaker's ledgers. Servants, freedmen, children from the infirmary, all entered Wren's cellar and did not return. What began as the act of one man soon drew others into its orbit, men of rank and education who feasted at his table, praising his refinement even as they partook in his sin. Their complicity would form what later historians would call the system. And within that system, Savannah's respectability became the mask of its damnation. By 1856, Thaddeus Wren's enterprise had grown beyond the walls of his Congress Street establishment. His reputation as a sanitary reformer and a benefactor to the city poor had elevated him to near-official status. He served on the Board of Health, advised the Ladies' Benevolent Society, and lectured before the Savannah Philosophical Association on the hygienic disposal of the deceased. But beneath this veneer of civic virtue, he was orchestrating a quiet economy of death. Official correspondence preserved in the Chatham County Archives, letters between Wren and Mayor Benjamin Ogletree, discuss arrangements for pauper removals and cost reduction through Wren's proprietary method of rendering. Those letters, though written in cautious bureaucratic tone, hint at complicity. Your procedure, Mr. Wren, spares the city considerable expense, and we commend your discretion in handling such sensitive materials. The materials were human remains. By tracing cross-referenced city records, later historians identified 47 individuals listed as disposed under commission between 1855 and 1858, none of whose burial certificates survive. The expansion, Wren's method was now industrial. The rendering cellar beneath his Congress Street building had been expanded, lined with copper piping to channel vapors out through the chimney. Apprentices delivered bodies from the infirmary after midnight, covered by canvas and straw to conceal the shapes. Those who questioned the work soon disappeared. Henry Coe, the fellow apprentice who once cautioned Nathaniel Harrow to keep silent, was last seen in January 1856. His name later appears only once more, in Wren's private account book beside the notation, HC material rendered $13 million net. To the public, Wren remained a figure of benevolence. His company offered reduced-rate funerals for soldiers' families, contributed coffins to churches, and published essays on cleanliness in the Savannah Republican. He wrote in 1857, "Let no man shrink from contact with mortality. From the dissolution of flesh arises the purity of spirit. We must learn to make use of every gift Providence returns to us." Many readers found the prose overly poetic, but none suspected its literal truth. 2. The inner circle. In those years, Wren cultivated a small circle of confidants, men of power who benefited from his silence and his feasts. The most notorious among them was Dr. Josiah Pemble, the very physician who had signed Nathaniel Harrow's death certificate. Trained in Charleston, Pemble fancied himself a man of science, and his association with Wren offered both prestige and profit. Documents uncovered in the 1920s reveal that Pemble provided medical certification for nearly every unclaimed death processed by Wren. His handwriting appears beside annotations such as non-contagious, suitable for rendering. The circle also included Silas Vaughan, attorney and executor of several wealthy estates, who arranged legal exemptions for the disposal of bodies without surviving kin. Captain Hiram Devereux, overseer of the city almshouse, who supplied the unclaimed dead in exchange for Wren's hygienic services. Mayor Benjamin Ogletree, who quietly renewed Wren's contracts and dined at his private table at least twice a year. The group met at Wren Hall, usually on the first Sunday of each quarter, under the pretense of charitable gatherings. Carriages would arrive discreetly after dusk, lamps in the upper rooms were extinguished, servants were dismissed early. In later decades, rumors among descendants referred to these as the renewal suppers. A surviving menu written in Wren's own hand and recovered from a locked desk at the estate sale in 1865 reads, soup à la marrow, roast of prime, aged refined, pudding of white essence, cordial of renewal. Each dish bore cryptic initials corresponding to entries in his ledger. The aged roasts, scholars believe, were prepared from the rendered and preserved flesh of the deceased, refined into lard, then reconstituted into dishes for the assembled guests. Wren's notes describe these suppers as ritual affirmations of the city's endurance. In one chilling passage dated June 1857, he wrote, "Each guest partakes, knowingly or not, of the labors and sufferings of Savannah's underclass. Thus the high are bound to the low in unbreakable communion. They feed upon the city, and the city feeds upon them." 3. The victims. Among the 47 confirmed victims, the archives preserve fragmentary stories of several. Their names, once lost, can now be spoken. Mary Abel, aged 9, orphan of the 1854 cholera outbreak, taken from the infirmary to Wren's care. Records of her burial are absent. Ephraim Carter, father of the earlier victim Samuel, taken under the same pauper commission. His name appears in Wren's ledger with the annotation, rendered, October 1856. Ruth Ann Devlin, Irish servant, dismissed from the Mercer household for theft, listed as fever casualty, but no physician's report exists. Jabez Miller, enslaved man from Bonaventure, property of Wren himself, disappeared after assisting in cellar construction. In each case, the victim belonged to a class unable to protest: the poor, the enslaved, the nameless. 4. The science. Wren's journals from this period, several volumes preserved through sheer accident in the courthouse vault, reveal a mind convinced of righteousness, as he wrote of separating vitality from corruption and restoring harmony to the social organism. His language merged anatomy with theology. One experiment titled, On the Reconstitution of Essence, describes a process wherein human fat was mixed with mercury salts and distilled into an amber oil he called oleum vitalis. He claimed it strengthened the blood when ingested in minute quantities. Pemble's medical notes corroborate this. Administered a draught of OV to subject with consumption, pulse steady for 1 hour, then death, no odor of decay observed thereafter. What horrifies the modern reader is not the primitive superstition, but the bureaucratic precision. Each experiment was labeled, dated, and signed. In effect, Wren had transformed Savannah's underclass into the raw material of a quasi-scientific cult, its rituals masquerading as progress, its murders disguised as hygiene. V. The outsider. In late 1857, suspicion came from beyond Savannah's closed circle. A journalist from Charleston, Thomas Layton, arrived to write a feature on modern funerary science. His articles in the Southern Quarterly praised innovation, and Wren, ever eager for recognition, welcomed him. Leighton toured the facilities, noting the cleanliness and absence of unpleasant odor. Yet he found the Undertaker's cellar curiously warm for a morgue. After his visit, Leighton began receiving anonymous letters, perhaps from one of Wren's servants, warning him that the master's wine is drawn from the dead. Intrigued, he sought records of Wren's contracts with the almshouse, but the clerk refused access. 2 nights later, Leighton's rented room at the Pulaski house was burgled. His notes were taken, and by morning, he was gone. The Charleston Courier later reported that he had returned north in poor health. No further trace of him appears in any archive. 6. The pattern. By 1858, the renewal suppers had become routine among Savannah's most prominent families. Invitations were never written. Word traveled through private conversation. Attendees included merchants, city officials, even visiting clergy. The dinners were framed as charitable events honoring the city's deceased. Few guests suspected, and those who did remained silent. Over the years, patterns emerged. Servants employed at Wren Hall rarely survived more than 2 seasons. Each spring, the Undertaker's accounts showed large purchases of wine and salt, coinciding with declines in the almshouse census. The city's refuse records show deliveries of lime to the Wren estate at irregular but frequent intervals. What bound these threads together was fear. Wren's allies relied upon him, not only for discretion but for the literal erasure of their misdeeds. A dead mistress, an unwanted child, an inconvenient debtor, all could vanish into his sanitary service. 7. The silence. Contemporary correspondence between Mayor Ogletree and the City Council, uncovered in 1919, suggests awareness of the rumors. Certain talk circulates among the colored servants concerning unwholesome practices at the house of Mr. Wren. I recommend the matter be allowed to rest, lest scandal afflict the families of good standing who have partaken of his hospitality. And so the silence continued. 8. The cost. The price of that silence was not only moral, but mortal. Several of Wren's dinner guests began to suffer strange illnesses, stiffness of the limbs, fits of fainting, and delirium marked by vivid hallucinations. Physicians called it nervous exhaustion. Wren himself offered to prepare tonics for their relief. The ingredients, his notes reveal, contained trace amounts of antimony, the same compound that paralyzed Nathaniel Harrow. In a ledger dated March 1859, he wrote, "The tincture refines the blood, subdues the passions, and binds the participants in shared frailty. Thus, all partake of the same condition, the same dependence." In essence, he was poisoning his benefactors slowly, ensuring their continued obedience. By 1860, clouds of war gathered over the South. Savannah's fortunes wavered, and Wren's circle began to fracture under financial strain. Several members fled north or joined Confederate ranks. Those who remained grew increasingly paranoid. Wren's dinners became smaller, the atmosphere more somber. His notes from February 1861 mention decline of spirit among brethren and necessity of renewal through fire. He was preparing for something, an act that would cleanse or destroy. Within a year, the Civil War would begin, and the chaos of conflict would mask the final dissolution of his enterprise. But the machinery he built, the system of silence, of complicity, of consumption, would outlast him. Even as Savannah burned and armies marched, no one dared open the cellars of Wren Hall. They said the air within still breathed, warm as if from sleeping lungs. Narrator pauses, voice lowering. When the Union troops entered Savannah in late 1864, they found the city intact but hollow, as though something vital had already been devoured. In the deserted mansion north of town, they discovered barrels of lime, sealed jars, and ledgers whose writing had faded beneath a film of wax. The papers were confiscated and sent north for examination, then quietly disappeared into government archives. Only fragments remain. And from those fragments, we reconstruct not a single madman's crime, but a system of belief, one that made the consumption of the powerless both literal and respectable. When war came to Savannah, Thaddeus Wren was already an old man. His beard had turned the color of lime. His eyes, once steady as a surveyor's line, now trembled at the edges. Yet he persisted in his work, calling it a sacred duty to the city's endurance. The world he had built through secrecy began to crumble as the Confederacy fractured. His patrons, the merchants, the aldermen, the families who once dined beneath his chandeliers, fled or fell to ruin. Their houses stood boarded, their portraits veiled, but Wren remained. In his final surviving journal, dated April 1861, he wrote, "Let others flee. I am rooted in the soil. Death will not harm me. I am its servant." He took no side in the conflict. His workshop, once filled with apprentices, now employed only two silent figures, an aged freedman named Isaiah Boone and a mute boy called Lem, both of whom would later testify to what happened in those years. The war brought an abundance of bodies. Hospitals overflowed, supply lines broke, and the smell of decay drifted through the streets like incense. To the remaining city officials, Wren's skills became indispensable once more. In 1862, the municipal council granted him full authority over removals of the unclaimed dead. He received funding, materials, and permission to operate without oversight. Under the guise of sanitary cremation, he began collecting wagon loads of corpses from field hospitals beyond the city. His cellar fires burned day and night. Isaiah Boone would later recall, "He said he was saving them, not the bodies but what was in them. He said the war was just the earth feeding itself." Wren's notebooks from this period, written in a feverish scrawl, describe his work as transmutation. He no longer used the language of preservation or refinement. Now he spoke of fusion, communion, and the great joining. In one passage he wrote, "What began as Revis shall end as revelation. Through the blood of the fallen, Savannah shall be reborn." On December 24, 1863, while cannon fire echoed across the river, Wren hosted his final supper. The invitation, delivered by hand to a few surviving elites, read simply, "For the renewal of the city, one last service." 5 men attended: Mayor Ogletree, pale and trembling; Dr. Pemble, whose hands shook uncontrollably; Silas Vaughan, the lawyer, reduced by bankruptcy but clinging to old manners; and 2 planters whose lands had long since been seized. They came not out of affection for Wren, but out of fear. Each had benefited once from his silent dealings. Each knew what would happen if he were ever allowed to speak freely. The dining room at 112 Habersham Street was lit by candles set into skull-shaped holders, the wax dripping down like flesh. The tablecloth, linen once white, had been dyed an uneven brown, the color of dried blood. A decanter of dark wine stood at the center beside a covered dish that steamed faintly. Wren welcomed his guests with solemn courtesy. "Tonight," he said, "we feast not in gluttony, but in gratitude." Isaiah Boone, serving from the shadows, would later swear that he recognized the shape of a human hand beneath the dish's crust. He had not prepared it. He dared not ask who had. Throughout the meal, Wren spoke of sacrifice, of the city's decay, and of his intention to bind its soul to survival. His guests shifted uneasily, drinking heavily. He passed them each a thin slice of meat, insisting they partake. "The dead sustain the living," he said softly. "So it has always been." Mayor Ogletree tried to leave first, but Wren barred the door. "You have eaten," Wren told him. "Now you belong." That was the last anyone saw of the mayor alive. 3 days later, his house burned to the ground, taking his wife and 2 daughters with it. The official report called it an accident, a chimney fire during shelling. But surviving ledgers show the mayor's estate was seized by Wren's legal proxy within the week. By 1864, as Sherman's army drew near, the city dissolved into chaos. Wren's mansion stood untouched amid looted homes, as if invisible. Witnesses later claimed to see carts arriving at night, drawn by mules without drivers, unloading shrouded forms at his gate. When Union troops finally entered Savannah in December, they found the house abandoned. What they found inside was worse than any rumor. In the basement, soldiers discovered rows of sealed crates containing salted remains, arms, torsos, fragments of bone labeled with initials and dates. On the wall above the furnace, carved deeply into the brick, were the words, "The feast continues." A cistern nearby held a dozen human skulls arranged in a circle, each etched with a single letter. The letters, when arranged, spelled resurgam, Latin for "I shall rise again." Captain Horace Miller of the 3rd Michigan recorded the find in his field diary, writing, "The stench was of something once human. The cellar glowed faintly, as if the walls themselves had absorbed heat from the fires he kept. We sealed it and posted guards, but by dawn the house was aflame from within. No one saw who started the fire. No body was ever found. Some said Wren escaped south under an assumed name, dying years later in a sanitarium near Mobile. Others believed he perished in the blaze, consumed by his own creation. Isaiah Boone swore under oath that he saw Wren standing at the top window that night, the flames behind him outlining his form. He wasn't burning, Boone said. He was smiling. After the fire, the ground around 112H, Habersham, was salted and left fallow. The Union provost ordered the area quarantined for reasons of health, but stories persisted of low moaning heard beneath the soil, of hands pressing against the ground from below, of meals that turned bitter in nearby kitchens. Within months, both Dr. Pemble and Silas Vaughan were dead. Pemble's body was found seated upright in his office chair, eyes open, skin grey and papery. Vaughan's remains were never located. His diary ended with a single line. He promised the feast would not die. By 1866, Savannah had begun to rebuild. The name Wren appeared nowhere in public record. His deeds, contracts and property titles were declared null by military order. The lot at 112 Habersham was eventually purchased by a northern investor who built a small boarding house there. In 1871, the boarding house burned as well. The fire chief at the time, Thomas Clay Jr., noted in his report, "Origin unknown. Witnesses described the smell of sweet oil and something else, like meat burning slow." Decades later, long after the war and Reconstruction, children playing in the area would dig up strange relics, pieces of porcelain with names scratched off, a silver fork bent into a cross, and once, a narrow glass vial filled with a dark, congealed residue. No one connected these findings publicly to Wren. His name was spoken only in whispers. Yet among the city's oldest families, it became a warning told in half-light. Beware the man who eats alone. Even now, local historians debate whether Thaddeus Wren died in the fire or simply stepped into the dark river of his own making. But the ledger that surfaced in the 1920s, stained, half-legible, and authenticated by archivists, bears his handwriting and one final phrase at the bottom of its last page: "The living forget, the soil remembers." And somewhere beneath Savannah, where the foundations of new buildings press into the earth, there are still places where the ground smells faintly of smoke and iron, and where candles refuse to burn steady. Because some say the feast was never truly finished. When the fires of 1864 faded and Savannah began to rebuild, the story of Thaddeus Wren slipped quietly into absence. His mansion became an empty lot, his name vanished from ledgers, and the living grew content to forget. Reconstruction brought new faces, new money, new shame. The few who had known the truth died out, taking their memories with them. Yet Savannah is a city that never truly erases. The air holds what was spoken, the soil keeps what was buried. And so, for those who listen closely, fragments remained. In 1889, a local mason named Elijah Sims was hired to repair a drainage wall near the old Habersham site. While digging, he uncovered what he described as an unnatural layer, brickwork far older than the surrounding foundation. Within it lay a recess, sealed with pitch and a single iron clasp. Inside was a glass jar, its contents dark, syrupy, and sealed with wax impressed by a signet ring marked TW. The city health officer ordered it destroyed, labeling it chemical waste. But Sims kept the ring. It was later identified as the same design used by the Mortuary Guild of 1853. Nothing else was said. By the turn of the century, the name Wren had become a minor footnote in Savannah's property disputes, a missing estate occasionally mentioned in court filings but never pursued. Then in 1912, a visiting historian from Charleston, Dr. Lionel Cray, came across an unsigned diary while cataloguing the holdings of a private library. Its pages, brittle and speckled with mold, recounted a banquet of decay held on the eve of Sherman's approach. Cray traced the handwriting to Silas Vaughan, the city's former solicitor, whose death had gone unrecorded. When Cray attempted to publish his findings, the manuscript was confiscated by the Historical Society, which deemed it too speculative for public release. Officially, they claimed it had been misplaced in transit. Privately, correspondence between board members reveals the truth. One of the city's trustees was a Wren descendant. The society suppressed the document to protect the dignity of surviving families. Cray, humiliated, left Savannah and never returned. He died in 1918, his papers lost during a fire at his boarding house. Only a single letter survived, preserved by a colleague. There are places where death feeds itself. Savannah is one. They will not speak of it because they still dine upon its memory. By the 1920s, the old district began to change again. The lot at 112 Habersham was repurposed for a small municipal building, the Office of Vital Records, ironically situated atop what had once been the Undertaker's cellar. During construction, workers unearthed charred wood, iron fastenings, and a section of stone bearing etched initials. The foreman, uncertain of their meaning, ordered the debris buried beneath the new foundation. One laborer, Samuel Boyd, later told a reporter that he saw what looked like a ribcage turned to coal. The statement was never printed. In 1934, a WPA architectural survey listed the site as of indeterminate history, former private residence burned c. 1864. The accompanying notes contained a single curious annotation. Ground unusually soft beneath southeast corner, odor of resin and oil persists. That same year, a city archivist named Eleanor Finch began cataloguing antebellum death records recovered from a flooded basement of the courthouse. Among the ruined volumes, she found a bundle of sealed correspondence bound with black ribbon and labeled, "To be opened upon the passing of all concerned." The handwriting matched that of Thaddeus Wren. Finch's notes described the letters in meticulous detail. Most were addressed to city officials of the 1850s, and each bore a single Latin salutation, memento vivere, remember to live. Inside were invoices for provisions, oils, and preservatives, totaling sums large enough to fund a small plantation. One letter contained a chilling postscript, "The living must consume to endure. I offer them that mercy." Finch submitted her discovery to the Historical Society. Within weeks, she was reassigned to clerical work. The letters disappeared. 2 years later, Finch died suddenly of respiratory paralysis following dietary collapse. Her physician described symptoms consistent with chronic arsenic exposure. After her death, her niece, Margaret Holt, a journalist for the Savannah Evening Ledger, found Finch's private notebook. It contained sketches of the letters and a partial transcription of Wren's final entry. "They will eat as I have eaten, and never know. The seed is in them now." Holt attempted to publish her aunt's findings in a serialized article titled The Undertaker's Table. Only the first installment reached print before the paper received a directive from the city council to terminate the series. Holt relocated to Atlanta, where she continued her research for several years before vanishing in 1941. Her disappearance coincided with the demolition of the Vital Records building. A new courthouse annex was erected in its place. Construction reports from that year mention repeated equipment malfunctions and subterranean instability. In one entry, a foreman complained, "No matter how deep we pour the foundation, it sinks by morning. The earth here swallows what we build." By mid-century, the legend of Thaddeus Wren had mutated into local folklore. Children whispered of the man who feeds the ground. Older residents avoided the corner of Habersham and East Charlton, claiming the air there tastes of pennies. In 1952, a professor from Emory University, Dr. James Lawton, collected oral testimonies from surviving families. One elderly woman, identified only as Mrs. C, said her grandmother had been a servant in the Wren household and once delivered a basket of bread to the cellar. She claimed she heard whispers beneath the floor, voices murmuring the Lord's Prayer backward. Lawton dismissed it as superstition, but his research took a darker turn when he discovered a ledger in the city archives labelled Wren Sons, Undertakers, Receipts, 1854 to 1856. Inside were detailed lists of names, dates and body weights, all matched against notations like yield satisfactory, spoiled and reserved. The handwriting was Wren's. The ledger vanished after Lawton's initial citation. In his last recorded lecture before his death in 1963, Lawton concluded with the following remark: "Savannah, for all its beauty, stands upon a banquet table, and some meals are never cleared away." That same year, the courthouse annex suffered a partial collapse following heavy rain. Rescue crews reported finding pockets of hollow ground filled with blackened timbers and bone fragments. The county coroner classified them as animal remains. A month later, the site was paved over and turned into a parking lot. In 1974, a group of amateur historians petitioned the city to mark the site as one of archaeological interest. Their request was denied. The committee's minutes note, in a single sentence, "Certain families requested discretion." By the 1980s, only the most persistent researchers even mentioned Wren's name. A few surviving documents surfaced in private collections, receipts, letters, a piece of embroidered linen marked with the initials T.W., but all without provenance. Then in 1997, during the renovation of a nearby townhouse, workers discovered a section of brick tunnel extending toward the river. At its end stood a corroded iron door. Stenciled faintly on the wall beside it was a date, 1855. The door was sealed with a welded plate and officials ordered it left untouched. One foreman later told a reporter that he heard something behind it, a faint scratching, like nails across slate. The interview was never aired. By the early 2000s, the site had become a kind of quiet taboo. The parking lot was repaved, then fenced off, and eventually incorporated into a courthouse expansion project. The official plans mention subsurface anomalies and organic material unsuitable for foundation stability. Beyond that, nothing. In 2018, during an academic survey of neglected municipal archives, historian Dr. Caroline Hurst rediscovered Eleanor Finch's surviving notes. In them were faint carbon copies of Wren's letters and one chilling phrase that has since haunted every researcher who's read it. "In the marrow of the city, I have planted eternity." Hurst traced references to unexplained cases of paralysis in the district between 1867 and 1872, mostly servants and labourers who worked in buildings constructed atop the old Habersham property. Their symptoms mirrored those of arsenic poisoning, though none were fatal. She theorized that contaminated groundwater from the Undertaker's cellars might have leached into surrounding wells. Her paper, The Chemical Ghost of Savannah, was submitted to a historical review board in 2021. It has yet to be approved for publication. Even now, the city maintains no official record of Thaddeus Wren's existence. His census entries are blank. His business licenses are listed as voided. His burial is unrecorded, and yet his handwriting, his materials, his signature all survive in fragments across a dozen sealed collections. In 2024, ground-penetrating radar used during courthouse renovations detected a void beneath the southeastern wing, circular, roughly 10 feet in diameter. When excavation was proposed, the project was halted for safety. The report was redacted before public release, so the question remains, what lies beneath Savannah still? Some say the air there grows warm on winter nights, as if the earth breathes. Some say that if you stand long enough at the corner of Habersham and East Charlton, you can smell cooked oil, faint and sweet. And sometimes, very rarely, when the ground shifts after rain, the pavement cracks open to reveal a glint of glass, or the corner of a sealed jar marked faintly with a TW. Perhaps it is nothing. Perhaps it is the city's way of remembering. Because Savannah is a place that consumes its past to survive, and perhaps, as Wren believed, the feast never truly ended. Even now, beneath the courthouse and parking lots, beneath the trees and the heavy summer air, something waits. Silent, patient, eternal. And if you listen carefully, you might still hear it. A slow, deliberate tapping from far below, like someone asking to be let in from the cold. What do you think of this story? Do you believe every secret was truly revealed, or does Savannah still keep part of the feast hidden? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure you're subscribed, ring the bell so you never miss another hidden history, and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. I'll see you in the next story.